Hey y'all, it's Dr. D. Welcome to the class. This is our first video, and I'm going to try to keep it short, but I'm honestly, it's going to meander a little bit. Uh, it's just an intro video. I want to bring you up to speed on what microeconomics is and how to think about it. But my thinking on this has changed a lot over the last decade or whatever, and I'm probably going to give you an answer that's going to be different than you get from other people. I think my answer to this is relatively unique. And so just want to prepare you for that. I'll give you the textbook definition. We're going to have a quiz. I want you to be able to fill out the quiz and know all the things the textbook will want you to know. But I also think a lot of econ doesn't make sense unless you understand a little bit on a little bit of a deeper level, like what is going on. So briefly speaking, economics is the study of scarcity. Economics is the social science of choices made under conditions of scarcity. That's one way to think about it. That's one of the textbook definitions I like. There's another textbook definition that you might see, which is maybe the study of people's behavior, let's say, in the ordinary business of life. It's one of the things that makes economics so powerful is that it really is a sort of has lots of applicability. But all the things that get called economics, and this is really micro, right? This is really micro. It's hard to make sense of the things that get called economics without having a more coherent view, because you hear like podcasts like Freakonomics or stories about like ways in which economists are influencing like doctors' decision making, and then maybe also like looking at crime and lead exposure and crime. Looking at one of my favorite economist studies, sex workers and the ways in which the legal system affects the choices that they make, just because he does really good work. That's interesting. A lot of things fall under this microeconomics, and I think it's tricky to make sense of these without knowing a little bit more about things like what does social mean, what does science mean, what are choices, and what is scarcity. And what do we mean by those things? I'm reading a book, sort of apropos. It's definitely changed some of my thinking, called What We Owe to Each Other, by Tim Scanlon. It's a work of moral philosophy, I'd say. And I think it's worth knowing that a little bit of the history of science. So science comes clearly from philosophy, right? So the first scientists, what we might call natural scientists, were sometimes called natural philosophers. And then there were also moral philosophers. So this is like the Enlightenment when we're talking about history, right? So we're talking about like mid to late 1700s, maybe early 1700s, right? And almost all the social sciences kind of come out of this moral philosophy. And moral philosophy really is trying to answer the question, how to be good and how to do well, something like that. Those are kind of the questions. So what do they take from each other? A lot of math, or a lot of the math of econ, comes from the natural philosophers. Comes from, this would be like physics or chemistry, things like that. And a lot of that math, especially from physics, really influences the moral philosophers, right? They really are amazed at the harmony of the orbits of planets, like Newton's work, right? And then they became interested and learned from them. And so that math influences these decisions. Really, I think what makes it a science is a few things, right? So one of these is one of the things that makes it a science is that the primary principle is, or one of the foundational principle is doubt. Okay, so doubt matters a lot, right? So how is truth? Truth and falsifiability are really important in all sciences. And in the philosophy of science, it's tricky to wrap your head around this because it's a very weird way of thinking about truth, that I don't think it comes naturally to people. It's a disciplined approach that happens to be really useful for discovering, figuring out whether an idea is bad in particular. In science, truth is contingent, and essentially permanent skepticism is the appropriate stance. Not knee-jerk skepticism where you just don't believe anything somebody says, but just always being open to the idea that something is wrong. Doesn't mean that we are convinced things are wrong. That's not actually skeptical of our own position. Always open to the idea that a given proposition is wrong. So some statement could be wrong. So that's part of what makes science science. And this is about knowledge. You don't need to know this word, but if you want to talk about the philosophy of knowledge, that the philosophy of knowledge in general is called epistemology. And every discipline sort of has its own epistemological position. Science in general, and the social sciences in particular, well, I guess all the sciences really are committed to this idea, right? That there's this contingent and permanent skepticism, right? And then if we can't prove an idea false, then it's not open to science, right? So you have it's always good to know. Scientists are a good scientist, whether they actually do this or not is tricky. But what would it take to change my mind is a good question to ask yourself regularly if you're engaged in the practice of science. To always know, okay, so for example, I personally don't believe that, and this is contentious, so I'll just put this out there, but I personally don't believe that raising the minimum wage is going to have a strong effect on changing employment. And I've changed my mind about that. I used to think raising the minimum wage would have big disemployment effects. It still might be worth it, but people will lose jobs if they raise the minimum wage. And then people have studied this, and they found answers that convinced me that, like, actually, it's not that big of an effect. Not zero, but it's not large enough to really make me concerned that much about, especially about small changes in the minimum wage. And we'll talk about models of that later in this class. One of the results of this. Of this being the idea that we want to prove propositions wrong over and over and over again. That's how science works. So that the set of things we believe, when we say scientific truth, what truth really means in that sense is things we haven't proved wrong yet. They still all might be wrong, or many might be wrong. But that's sort of the strength of the epistemological claim. When we say something is true in a scientific sense, really just we mean it hasn't been proven wrong yet. It's contingent. That's what I mean by truth is contingent, right? Until further notice. So that's what we mean by scientific truth. In addition to that, let's see. The other thing that I want to talk about, that's right, in particular, is what this implies. If we're trying to prove things wrong, we get to how can you prove something wrong? Gets to be a big question. So this is all just science. So I want to be clear. What we're talking about now is science, and we'll get to other parts of this in a minute. This is really actually one of the biggest strengths of economics. I mean, microeconomics in particular has gotten pretty good at this. This is about methodological positioning. So epistemology in science is part of this answer, right? How do you prove something wrong? What does it mean to know something? But methodology is really important. So now let's talk a little bit more about economics, because the methodology of economics is really important. The topics of microeconomics, the thing we generally are interested in, is individual behavior in ordinary society. Meaning we're not putting people under an MRI. We might, but we're not interested in how individuals function in a controlled environment. We're interested in how individuals function in engagement with one another, and what that does, right? What kind of effects that has, and what kind of predictions we can make. And when I say under scarcity, the reason is that what we found is that this individual behavior, it often is responsive to scarcity. And that scarcity can be real or perceived. But what I'll say is I have learned through thought experiments and through observation that scarcity always obtains. So there is always scarcity. And humans are always fighting against it. Even if we achieved immortality, there would always still be scarcity. Humans push back. So, for example, it used to be the case that to travel across the country would be it used to be the case that to travel across the country would be a thing that was very difficult to do, right? To travel across the United States. It's still, it's still kind of a pain or whatever, but it's not the case anymore that it's nearly as difficult to do so. So let's see if I can. I want to pull up a map here just to give you a sense of this. Let's see. So it used to be the case that to travel across the country was something that would take, you could do it maybe once or twice in your life, right? So if you wanted to go from one side of the country to the other, right, like the Oregon Trail or something like that, it would take a long time, right? Start here and then you kind of work your way across and you hit the mountains, you got to hike and camp and whatever. And maybe my sister lives in Seattle, so let's say we wanted to visit her. You could maybe do this one time or 10 times, maybe max in your life. That's not true anymore, right? It is now true that people regularly cross the continent for work 10 times a year, let's say, right? 10 times a year is a thing that happens. People go back and forth 10 times a year. More, less, fewer. Most people don't, but you can, right? This is humans pushing back against the scarcity. Let's talk about where the scarcity comes from. Right? It is true, no matter what, that there are going to be 24 hours in a day. And given that there are 24 hours in a day, we have to decide how to spend them. Or fail to decide. Right? Maybe some days we do a lot of exciting things. Maybe other days we do boring things so we can save our resources for a later date where we're going to do a lot of exciting things, right? Each person gets one lifetime, right? Eventually we will die. And this scarcity creates value. One lifetime to live. This scarcity creates value. Okay. So what we do is we look at the choices people make. One of the things economics is interested in is, what do people value? Another question we ask is, how do people relax scarcity? Or how do they do the best they can within the scarcity is another question that we ask. These are questions that are important to us in order to study economics, which, when you start to think about it, becomes a set of best practices. That's another way to think about economics. Successful ways humans have battled scarcity. That's where trade comes from, right? The make-buy problem is an example of that, right? Do I make stuff or do I buy it? Well, I could make all my own food, but I would not be very good at it. I don't think I'd be a very good farmer. I have terrible eyesight. I'm not confident I'd be an excellent hunter. I could do it. I could survive. I could grind out a living, but it would be pretty. Subsistence farming is not a pleasant life. And so, instead, what I would prefer to do is to teach statistics and economics and do other things that play to my skills. I mean, somebody else who's good at farming, who has the tools for farming, including personal tools, but also physical capital, they can do the farming, and I do the teaching and studying and the math and Excel spreadsheets and whatever, and then we can exchange, right? I'll teach your kid statistics, you give me some food, or whatever. It's complicated if we try to barter, And so instead of bartering, right, one way we have battled scarcity is the introduction of money. Right? We have money. That's, money's a little bit more about macro, but it is a way. But clearly it's economics, right? Successful ways humans have battled scarcity. We introduce money so that we could battle scarcity better. Okay, so that's part of what economics is. But because we are studying people, so that's our topic. Our setting is in real life, right? Because we're studying people in real life, our data that we collect, that we observe, it's often observational. And that means with observational data, it is tricky to establish causation. We really want to know what people value, but it can be tricky to establish these links, right? So, for example, one way we battle scarcity is we try to educate ourselves and educate our people, right? If we are educated, then we can make better choices. We can do harder things, more specialized things that produce more value. And so, for example, let's say that one of those things we do is we want to introduce universal pre-K. But we want to make an argument for that, right? Should we have universal pre-K? Well, what we'd like to be able to show, to find out if it's false or not, is this false? Pre-K has no effect on your academic ability. I hope it's false, because I think when I send my kids to pre-K, I hope it's false. But we want to know, how would you prove this is false? Well, one way you could take a first crack at it, and this is a bad way to do it, but you could say, look at kids in pre-K, and then follow them over their life, right? Years later. Now what we want to know is kids in pre-K have higher education rates, right? So higher education rates. They go to college more. Maybe they have lower incarceration rates. They go to jail less. Yay! Does this prove this false? There's a problem, because it turns out that there's also other things going on here, right? We got kids in pre-K. Well, it turns out if you're a kid in pre-K and we don't have universal pre-K, you have more involved parents. You must, because they had to sign you up for pre-K, right? You also have better nutrition, because they probably had to pay for it. It means they're also probably wealthier, right? Higher family income. Okay, so instead of looking at pre-K, we now have a cluster of features that do yield, like we can say something in here is causing higher ed rates and lower incarceration rates, but we can't know if it's the pre-K or not. And so microeconomics in particular also has methodological approaches. This is part of microeconomics, and its application, but is often called econometrics. And econometrics is kind of linked to data science, but really what it does is it tries to pick apart. A lot of what economists do, microeconomists do, is pick apart complicated data generating processes, I guess is what you might call it. Messy life stuff, right? That's a fancy way of saying like messy life stuff, to try to say, is it the case that universal pre-K would lead to higher education rates and lower incarceration rates? The answer seems to be yes, right? It does seem to be the case that this is false. Is this false? There's a recent study that just came out that did involve universal pre-K, right? And they were able to do some cool stuff with when the universal pre-K started, to establish like kids who right before that deadline, who looked similar in ways to kids right after that deadline who were enrolled in universal pre-K, did not have higher SAT scores, right? So it's complicated. The effect it has on your academic ability is not obvious and clear. but it does have an effect, right? It had an effect on the likelihood of taking the SAT, also the likelihood of going to college, also the likelihood of going to prison, right, to going to jail. So it reduced incarceration rates, reduced high school dropout rates, so higher high school graduation rates as well. So what is economics? Well, I mean, economics is the study of the social science of choices made under conditions of scarcity. But as a result of that, right, we study people in society, in groups, the effects that they have on their groups, the ways in which they organize themselves. We study it from an epistemological position of fundamental skepticism, right? We want to see if we can prove things true or false. And when we think we know something, we don't know it with certainty, right? We're open to the possibility that what we currently think will be updated in the future by new knowledge. We care a lot about the choices people make, right? That's one of the things we spend a lot of time talking about, because those choices, that behavior, drives a lot of results. It shapes our society in ways. And fundamentally, the topic that we're interested in, the thing we're focused on, is the choices that are made under conditions of scarcity, because that's when choices matter. That's when choices matter. If things aren't scarce, people don't think that hard about their choices. But when things are scarce, their choices take into account their underlying values. They think about trade-offs. And so the principles we're going to learn about, just to lay them out for you. The next video, we're going to talk about some of these principles. But economists end up with a framework for making decisions, right? This is sort of what I meant by this list of, where is that? Best practices, successful ways humans have battled scarcity, right? A principled way of thinking seems to drive people who make choices in a way that is successful. And I guess the last thing I want to talk about before I talk about that, now that I think about it, is the difference between positive and normative economics. I know this is a long intro video, but it's important. This is all useful ways to think about this. Positive, sometimes this is called descriptive. Normative, this is sometimes called prescriptive. And this is descriptive, is like what people do. And prescriptive is like what people should do. And so this is the tricky part where we get into is this moral philosophy or not? And it really depends. I personally am of the belief that whenever people say should, there's always a hidden thing. If you want to X, you should. So when people say, like, you should be nice to your mom or whatever, you should do Y. You should be nice to your mom, you should whatever. There's always this hidden if you want to X, which is like if you want to, in that case, maybe it's if you want to honor the contributions that mothers typically make, although not all of them, right? People have complicated relationships with their mothers. Some, people are people. They're varied, and so a lot of times these normative statements of you should do X, Y, you should do Y, because they carry with them this hidden, conditional. Would be considered conditional. They can be loaded, and I want to say normative economics, what people should do, is often loaded, right? It often leads to weird stuff. It's based on the underlying philosophy. Normative economics is based on an underlying philosophy that is often called money metric. Not often called, it often is money metric, welfaristic, individual, money metric, welfaristic utilitarianism. So that's a big bunch of words, but in short, what it means is, if you want to know how good society is, you measure in dollars how well off everyone is, then add them up. And that has a lot of problems. So I just want to caveat, every time we talk about normative economics, I want you to know that it works a lot of the time, but there are some cases, in particular, where there's a lot of inequality, or where there's not a lot of thought about the future, right? Like pollution or conservation or climate control or climate change, things like that, carbon, where this stuff doesn't work real well, because when we talk about individual money metric welfaristic utilitarianism, measure things in dollars and add up all the dollars, you run into problems, right? People with lots of dollars get more votes because you get one vote per dollar, really. So, but the principles that we're going to look at when we talk about making good decisions in this sense, in the sense that like they'll make you better off. But first one is we tend to think about the cost and the benefits, called the cost benefit principle. Second one is when we're considering alternatives, we generally want to compare things to the next best alternative. We say, well, if I didn't do this, what else would I do? And those are the meaningful comparisons. That's called the opportunity cost principle. We tend to think at the margin. So rather than thinking about how much milk do I want to buy for the year, I tend to think like, oh, do I need one more gallon of milk, or oh, do I need one more half gallon of milk, or whatever. Right? I'm thinking about the next unit. That's called the marginal principle. And we try to stay tuned to how our decisions depend on each other, right? If I make this decision, I'll have to make this other set of decisions. And so trying to think about that helps us do a better job of making those choices. And that's called the interdependence principle. Just want to kind of lay that out for you. I know this was longer of an intro video than I meant for it to be, but it's pretty important. It's got stuff in here that you just won't hear other places. I think here you have like the roots of. I'm an economist. I believe in a lot of this stuff, but also like I have I have a healthy critical view on my own discipline, and the critical view I think is not good if it's just like, oh, money whatever's bad, and rich people whatever, like people get all riled up, and it makes sense in ways like people have reasons to dismiss or judge or think that we're missing the boat. It's better if you know why, right? I think economics is great. I think microeconomics is great. I think we're learning a lot about the way it's the best way to help make the world a better place. Honestly, I believe that. That's why I studied it. But if we don't notice that we're measuring things in dollars and that has problems, then that's a problem, right? And the good things about it, right? The good things about it, the more you understand, we have these methodological approaches because we care about getting the right answer to the question, right? We don't want to be wrong for a long time, right? We really want to know what effect does immigration have on wages, right? If you let more immigrants in, does that decrease the average wage or increase the average wage or have no effect? And the data right now, the data used to be clear that like with immigration you have a reduction in wages. That doesn't seem to be the case, right? The methods were not great. It looks like immigration actually probably does fine things for wages within the native population. On the other hand, we used to think that globalization didn't have an effect on wages. That seems clearly to be wrong now. The data really suggests that it was hard to see, but globalization reduced wages in the United States. And so we're always trying to learn. Methodology helps us. Knowing what we're doing helps us to learn these things better. It's a fantastic enterprise. I love microeconomics. I hope you will too. And next video, we're going to dig into the principles, the ways in which we think about the decisions we make, whether we realize it or not. All right. Thank you all. I'll see you soon. Good luck with the pre-quiz.